If you live in the Pacific Northwest of the United States, then you want to pay close attention to the ending of today's video. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel, because that's all we do. And we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So, if that's of interest to you, please ask the like button to go for a walk with you in northeastern Australia and push them into a jimpy plan. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Alright, let's get into today's story. In 1985, 36-year-old Michael Reamer was a roofer in Tacoma, Washington, and his boss described him as being a work hard, play hard type of guy. In the winter months, when there really wasn't any roofing to be done, Mike would supplement his income by trapping coyote, mink, and muskrat in the forest that butted up against the Nisqually River, which was an 80-mile stretch that ran right near his home. Most of the traps Mike would set would be far away from any actual trail because wherever there was a trail, you would have human foot traffic, and that would scare away the animals that you're trying to catch in your trap. And so, as a result, he would place his traps in very remote, isolated sections of the forest, which many needed to know where those sections were. And so, over the 15 years he spent trapping in this forest, he got really good at navigating it. It was like he had a map in his head of where everything was in this forest. Plus, Mike was already an avid outdoorsman, and so navigating a forest and being out in the wild was something that just kind of came naturally to him. Mike's girlfriend was a 21-year-old woman named Diana Robertson, and they had a 2-year-old daughter named Crystal. Mike and Diana had a rocky relationship, to say the least. In fact, in October of that year, Diana had filed a restraining order against Mike after he had kicked in the door and thrown her to the ground. Mike also always carried a gun on him, and he had a very quick temper. But despite their significant relationship issues, the one thing they could always see eye to eye on was their daughter, Crystal. They adored her, and when it came to decisions about her, they were always on the same page. It was whatever is in the best interest of Crystal. In December of that year, Diana and Mike were able to reconcile, and so Diana threw the restraining order out. And in fact, she and Crystal moved back in with Mike, which made Crystal very happy. Just a couple of days after moving back in, they decided they wanted to go out and go camping together as a family, and then also pick out a real Christmas tree that they could bring back for the holidays. And so, they settled on an area that was going to be in the same forest where Mike had all of his traps set. And they figured they could, get their family time in, they could get their Christmas tree, and Mike would be able to check his traps, saving himself from making another trip later on. So, on December 12th, the 3 of them loaded up into Mike's red pickup truck and they drove the 30 minutes down towards the Nisqually River where there was this logging road that Mike would use to park his truck and then walk in to check his traps. So Mike pulls over on the side of the road, they all hop out, and Mike leads the way right into the middle of the woods. There's no trail. Mike is just bringing them to an area where 1, his traps will be, and 2, he thinks is suitable for camping in for looking for a Christmas tree. Later that afternoon, Crystal was spotted walking around a parking lot of a Kmart, 20 miles away from where Mike had parked the car near the Nisqually River. And she's just walking around. She looks totally confused. She's all alone and the employees of the Kmart are looking out and they see this girl and they're all watching, waiting for her, our parents or a guardian or someone to walk over and show that they are with this girl. But after a couple of minutes, when no one does that, one of the employees goes out and tries to talk to her. And this employee would say when she talked to the girl, she kept looking over her shoulder and she was just terrified the whole time. And so, this employee asked her, what's your name? And she didn't say anything. She asked her, where are you coming from? Where are your parents? Who's looking after you? And to all the questions she was asked, she didn't say anything. She just looked terrified and was looking over her shoulder. And so this employee brings the girl back inside and they call the police. And so the police show up and they ask the girl the same questions that the employees have been asking her, and the girl's still not speaking. And so, after they made an announcement inside to say, "Hey, is anybody in here the parent or guardian of this child?" And no one came forward. They said, "Okay, well, we have no other choice, but we're gonna have to move her to temporary foster care." And so, they move her to a foster home, and then they put an ad out in the newspaper that day with a picture of her basically saying, "If you know me, contact this number." 2 days later, Crystal's maternal grandmother would see the picture in the newspaper, and the ad did not have a description of, how she was discovered. It just said she had been found at this particular Kmart, and if you know who she is, please contact this number. Even without the details, the grandmother knows something has gone wrong because there's no reason in the world those two parents would abandon their beloved Crystal. And so, she calls Diana, she calls Mike, they don't pick up the phone. That's when she calls the number and she says, "What's going on? I'm her grandmother. Where is she?" The police tell her to go to the foster home and they will meet her there and they're going to talk about what happened. So the grandmother flies to the foster home and she arrives there before the police. She goes inside and Crystal is so happy to see her. It's the first time Crystal has really broken out of that kind of catatonic state she had been in ever since she was found at the Kmart. So she runs up to her grandmother, they have this reunion, and the grandmother is so happy to see Crystal. But she's also thinking, where are your parents? Where are Diana and Mike? And so she asks Crystal, where are they? Honey, where's your mom? Where's your dad? And Crystal would speak to her grandmother and she would say, Mommy's in the trees. Her grandmother didn't know what this meant, and so she tried to ask clarifying questions, but Crystal was not very verbal. She was not able to articulate more than what she was saying. So she just kept repeating it, saying, Mommy's in the trees. Mommy's in the trees. And so then the police show up and the grandmother turns to them and she says, where are her parents? Where are Mike and Diana? And the police turn to her and they're like, we don't know. We found her abandoned in this parking lot and she wasn't speaking and no one knew anything about her. And so until right now, we didn't even know her parents' names. Do you have any idea where they might be? And the grandmother's like, I have no idea. I mean, I'm just learning about all this stuff now. But when I came over here, Crystal said to me, Mommy's in the trees. And, she's nodded soft. She's not very verbal, so she can't explain much more than that. But she just kept saying, Mommy's in the trees. And I know Mike liked to go camping in this one area near the Nisqually River. He keeps straps out near the edge of the water. He catches some small animals out there. So I know he goes out there and goes camping. And so, maybe that's what Crystal's referencing, that they were in the trees, so they were in that forest over there. The grandmother also gave the police the address to Mike's house and the police used that information to launch their search for the parents. And so, the first place they go is Mike's house, and all the lights are off, the door is locked, and his red pickup truck, because the grandmother said he drove a red pickup truck, his red pickup truck is not there. And so, they rule out his house. They're not there. And they begin flying a plane, not only over Coma, which is the area where they were living, but also over that forest that was right up against the Nisqually River. And as they're flying, they're looking for campsites that could potentially be Mike and Diana, but they're also looking for the red pickup truck, which is fairly distinctive. And after a couple of days of flying all over the forest and looking around the side streets, and putting people in the forest walking on foot, they couldn't find anything. And they turned the search off. And they would tell the grandmother and the rest of the family on Diana's and Mike's side that they really just needed to wait for more information to come in, because they couldn't just spend an indefinite amount of time scanning a fairly large area. They have all of Tacoma in this huge forest, and so everyone just had to wait. 2 months later, a man and his dog were out walking on this logging road that was about 10 miles away from the Nisqually River and 30 miles away from the Kmart where Crystal was found. And they're walking on this road and they see, way off in the distance, there's this truck that's pulled over to the side of this road. And even from a distance, they can tell it's covered in snow, but it hasn't snowed recently. There's snow on the ground, but the amount of snow that is on this truck indicates it's been sitting here for quite a while. And so, as they get closer to the truck, this man is looking around, seeing if maybe the owner is nearby, even though it seemed unlikely given the fact that it looks like it's been sitting here a while. And so, after he stands there for a minute looking around, feeling pretty confident there's no one in the area, he brushes the snow off the passenger side window and he looks inside. And he doesn't see anything at first, but he notices on the passenger front seat there is a significant amount of blood on the seat, or what appears to be blood. This startles the guy, so he backs up from it. And he and his dog very quickly leave this area because they're in this kind of desolate, logging road. He's pretty isolated. And so, he gets out of there as quickly as he can, and when he gets to a phone, he calls the police. Police show up and they brush the rest of the snow off, and they find it is a red pickup truck. It's Mike's red pickup truck. Mike and Diana's case had been very big news in the area when it happened, and the news had really not gone away. People were out there looking for this couple. And so, as soon as they saw this was Mike's truck, they start fanning out and searching the area, seeing if they can find any other clues about what happened to Mike and Diana. And very quickly, they discovered Diana's body. She was located not far from the red truck, just barely off the road in the forest. She was under several inches of snow, and she had been stabbed 17 times, and there was a tube sock wrapped around her neck. There was no sign of Mike. But once they got inside the truck, there was a manila folder that had been tucked up on the dashboard that just said, "I love you, Diana." When police showed that message to Diana's family, they all said that looks like Mike's handwriting. He used to send us handwritten Christmas cards, and that looks exactly the way he writes. As for the blood that was on the passenger seat inside the truck, it had been sitting out for too long, so they weren't able to determine whose blood it was, but they were able to determine it was human. So, between the blood on the front seat, the note that was left on the dashboard, the personal, furious nature of the way in which Diana was killed, combined with Mike's history of violence and his disappearance, cause he's not here anymore, that all made it seem an awful lot like Mike was the guy that did this. In fact, this made for a very tidy ending to a mystery that had actually started before Diana had been killed. On August 10th, 1985, so for months before Mike, Diana, and Crystal ventured off into the woods near the Nisqually River, 27-year-old Stephen Harkins and his girlfriend, 42-year-old Ruth Cooper, were going camping near the Nisqually River in the same forest. They were actually about 15 miles from where Diana's body was ultimately found, and they were very close to a number of Mike's traps, although they probably didn't realize they were near them. During their trip, an unknown assailant walked up to their campsite in the middle of the night and shot them both to death. Stephen was found right away, and he was found inside of a sleeping bag at their campsite, indicating he had been killed in his sleep. Ruth wasn't found for months, and when she was found 1.5 miles away from the campsite, and she had a tube sock tied around her neck, the same way Diana had. And the knot that was used on the tube sock was even the same as the knot used on Diana's tube sock. So the similarity was just too much to overlook, and so to the police, they're thinking Mike has to be the guy in both of these cases. He attacked Ruth and Stephen, perhaps because they were, on his territory where his traps were, and he didn't like that. He has a history of violence, and so he attacks them. And then, a couple months later, he attacks Diana and then he flees. As for his daughter being found alive at the Kmart, it would seem he just did not have it in him to harm his own child. And so, he dropped her off at the Kmart before he ultimately fled. Despite everything seeming to fit just perfectly to where, yep, Mike is definitely the guy, not only for Diana but for Ruth and for Stephen, we figured it out. Despite that being the overwhelming feeling, there were a couple of questions that remained unanswered. Like the FBI, they were unable to confirm the handwriting on that folder that said "I love you, Diana." They weren't able to confirm that in fact, was Mike's handwriting. Diana's family was really convinced it was his, but the FBI said it's not necessarily a match. And then you have the motives for the two crimes. We can understand one of them, him attacking Diana, unfortunately. people attack their partners all the time, and so we can then. We can understand that, we can rationalize that. But for him to attack Ruth and Stephen, two total strangers, because what? They encroached on your land. Even though it's not your land, it's public land and you just happen to put your traps out there? That didn't seem like a strong enough reason for him to want to kill them. But the circumstantial evidence was overwhelmingly pointing at Mike being the guy. You have the fact that he's this violent guy with a history of domestic abuse. He knows this area well where both crimes were committed. You have the tube sock tied around Diana the same way it's tied around Ruth. It just had to be Mike. And so, because the police felt so strongly it had to be Mike, they were willing to overlook these lingering questions. And so, the police wanted to issue an arrest warrant for Mike, but they needed to be able to prove he was alive, because if he was dead, then that calls into question his ability to have committed these two crimes. And so, they didn't have proof he was alive, and so, very quickly, this story faded out of the headlines because basically, everybody believed Mike had done it and he had run off somewhere, and maybe someday we'll figure out where he went and we'll bring him to justice. But until then, we know he's the guy. For years, no one heard from Mike. No one saw Mike. It was like he had just totally vanished. Crystal was raised by relatives, and many of the detectives that were working on these cases eventually retired or moved on. Then, 25 years later, in March of 2011, a hiker was walking through the forest near the Nisqually River, about 1 mile from where Diana's body was found, and they would stumble upon a piece of a human skull. She calls the police. Police show up, they search the area, and they discover another bone, a human jawbone. And it would turn out it was Mike's. The rest of Mike's remains were never found, and because there was so little of him to work with, police were not able to determine a cause of death. However, they were able to date his death back to almost exactly the same time frame that Diana had died. Additionally, investigators believe the reason they did not find more of Mike's remains is because he had been buried. The two bones that were found, the skull and the jawbone, they were located within 1 mile of where Diana's body had been found. In that area, after Diana had been found, had been scoured, they looked everywhere for clues. And because he apparently died at the same time she did, he would have been out there, and they would have found him. So the fact that they didn't find him can only mean he was underground. So, this all meant Mike could not have been the killer, because in order for him to have been the killer, he not only would have had to attack Diana and then drive his daughter to the Kmart and then dock her back to the forest. He would then need to take his own life and then also somehow bury himself. Some of the police officers that had worked that case were still on the police force. And so when they heard this news about Mike not being the killer, they were like, it never really made any sense that he would attack Ruth or Stephen unless he was a serial killer. And then it clicked. They probably were dealing with a serial killer. It just wasn't Mike. And their only eyewitness was the toddler, Crystal, who apparently the serial killer could not bring themselves to harm. And so, as a result, Crystal just sat there and watched these horrible things happen to her parents and then probably spent a fair amount of time with the serial killer afterwards, because they needed to drive her to the Kmart. Investigators and her family had tried to get her to give more information about what she had witnessed, but all she could say was "Mommy's in the trees." And so, there are really only two interpretations of what that means. Either, one, she was just stating that her mother was in the forest, and that would have been accurate. Or she's remembering her mother trying to escape a serial killer by climbing up into a tree. Or maybe even that she was in the tree with her mother as they both were trying to escape a serial killer with a knife. So when the police have this revelation that Mike was not the killer, that in fact it was probably a serial killer, and we know nothing about this serial killer besides what Crystal had to say as a toddler, and that didn't provide any sort of real clarity on who this person was or what their mo was, they went back and looked at all the unsolved murders in the Pacific Northwest, specifically around this forest. They discovered that, in addition to Mike and Diana and Ruth and Stephen, there were 4 other sets of couples that worked in and around this forest, and all of them bear striking resemblances to one another. The most recent attack that is associated with the tube saw killer occurred in 2006, but The reality is, police don't really know anything about the tube sock killer. All they know is that they're probably in the Pacific Northwest and they are definitely still at large. So, that's gonna do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. So, give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we will pin you at the top of the comment section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please go on a walk with the like button in northeastern Australia and push them into a jimpy plan. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3, 4, even 5 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's just JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok, where my username is MrBallen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit, just called our MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So, whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's gonna do it. Say yo. Today, we're gonna look at 3 of the most incredible survival stories of all time. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel because that's all we do. And we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So, if that's of interest to you, please invite the like button over to your house for Oreos and milk. But replace all of their Oreo screen filling with Play-Doh. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Alright, let's get into today's stories. In 1994, 39-year-old Mauro Prosperi took part in the brutal Marathon des Sables. It is a 6-day endurance race covering 155 miles through the Sahara Desert. The competition was known as one of the toughest in the world, but Prosperi was a former Olympic athlete, and he kept himself in unbelievable physical shape. He was also a police officer back in Italy, which kept him even more active, so he felt ready. The competition's desert terrain was so dangerous the participants had to indicate where they wanted their bodies sent if they did not survive the race. In preparation for the race, Prosperi would run 25 miles a day for weeks leading up to it, and he would give himself less and less water as he was running to get accustomed to dehydration. But despite how much he was training and his incredible athletic resume that showed he's someone that can probably do this, his wife was very concerned. But he would tell her, the worst thing that's going to happen to me is I'll get a little sunburned. The race kicked off at its starting point in Morocco on April 10th. And initially, it was going very smoothly. Prosperi was always at the front of the pack, and he was always the first Italian to finish that day's stage. And so, when he would finish, he would go to his tent and he'd put an Italian flag on the outside to show the other Italians doing the race where they could find him to come inside and chat. And he would say that part of the race was really fun. Then things went wrong on the 4th day, during the longest and most difficult phase of the race. When he set out that morning, it was already very windy, and he found himself in the section between these 2 big sand dunes. And the pace setters had already gone way ahead, so he's totally alone. And then out of nowhere, this massive sandstorm kicks up and completely blinds him. He can't go anywhere, cause he can't see where he's going. And so, he manages to kind of feel his way to this rock where he gets down behind this rock and he thinks to himself, I'll just wait it out and then continue on. But the sandstorm raged for 8 hours, and when it was finally done, it was totally dark outside. So Prosperi couldn't see anything. So he decides, you know what? I'm gonna have to sleep on the dunes and tomorrow morning I'll have to get up and keep going. And his biggest concern at this point was not that he was in a survival situation. It was, man, I was in 4th place in this race, and now with this huge setback, I'm probably gonna finish last. And so, when he went to sleep that night, all he was thinking about is, man, I gotta get up and go as fast as I can so I don't finish last tomorrow. But when the sun came up the next morning, Prosperi looked around and he realized he had a much bigger problem. The sandstorm had been so strong it had completely altered the landscape, The dunes had all moved around. He had no points of reference. And so, even though he had a map and he had a compass, he had no way to orient himself, so he had no idea what direction to go. Anybody that competed in this race really needed to be self-sufficient. And so Prosperi had a knife, he had plenty of dehydrated food, he had a sleeping bag, but he had very little water. He had about a half bottle of water because at each of the checkpoints during the day, the race officials would give you all of this water, and the idea was you would drink it all by the time you got to your next checkpoint. And he had not made it to the next checkpoint, and so he was very low on water. As he's looking around, realizing this is a really bad situation, he thinks to himself, other runners must have had this same thing happen to them. They probably had to hunker down yesterday during the sandstorm and they're just waking up now. They're looking around. I'm bound to find someone. We'll link up and we will get to the end of this race and we'll be just fine. And so he runs to the top of a sand dune and looks around expecting to see someone, and he doesn't. There's no one in all directions. It's just completely barren desert. And so he leaves that sand dune, goes up another one, and does the same thing. He's looking around and there's nobody. And over the course of several hours, he was just running to the peaks of these different sand dunes, expecting to see someone, not seeing anyone, becoming more panicked and expending more energy. And finally, by the late afternoon, when he's sweating profusely and the sun is bearing down on him and he still hasn't seen anyone, he realizes he's going to die if he keeps doing this and he needs to be smart about this. And so at this point, he went into survival mode. And he decided that the only times he's going to move are going to be at night and in the early morning hours, because those are the times when the sun is not up and it's still pretty cool and he can conserve energy that way. He also began peeing into bottles and began conserving his urine to drink later when he did run out of water. And so, over the next 2 days, he conserved his energy, but he was just kind of drifting through the desert and he wasn't really getting anywhere. He didn't know if he was making progress, cause he had nothing to go to. He wasn't seeing anyone, and he was starting to realize the situation is getting worse and worse by the minute. And then, in an incredible stroke of luck, he comes across this Muslim shrine in the middle of nowhere that Bedouins would use as they traveled across the desert. And he ran inside hoping that there would be a person in there, and there was a person in there. But they were dead inside of a coffin. But he was happy that he now had shelter over his head, and this felt like progress. He began taking stock of his new surroundings, and when he was inside the shrine looking up into the ceiling, he saw it was lined with hundreds of bats. And at this point, he's really hungry, he's really thirsty. And so he climbed up into the rafters and began grabbing handfuls of bats and drinking their blood. After drinking the blood of 20 bats, he used some of the wood that was inside of the shrine and he built a fire outside. And that would be his way to signal planes and helicopters going overhead that he assumed would be out looking for him. And so, he sets the fire and he comes back inside expecting, over the next couple of days, someone's bound to find him. But nobody does. And for days go by, and 3 separate times a plane or helicopter flew directly over him. He's got his fire going, he's out there flagging them down, but nobody saw him. And so, at the end of those 4 days, he's now been out in the desert roaming around for nearly a week. And he's starting to realize that this is the end. He's not going to survive this. No one knows where he is. No one's seen him so far. He's running out of supplies. This is it. And so, knowing he was staring down a long, painful death, either by dehydration or starvation, he decided he was going to expedite it. And he would say later that he did not feel sad about this. It just was a logical choice he was making. He figured this way, if he died inside of the shrine was more likely to be found than if he had died somewhere out in the desert where sin would cover him up. And so, he said it was more likely people would find the shrine and therefore find him. And so, there would be closure for his family. And so Prosperi took a piece of charcoal from the fire, wrote a message to his wife, and then cut his wrists and laid down, expecting never to wake up again. But the next morning, he woke up and he had barely bled because his blood was too thick. He literally could not bleed to death. He took this as a sign that he was supposed to live, and he suddenly felt motivated to survive. He decided to leave the shrine and follow the advice that one of the race organizers had given all of them at the start, which was, if you get lost, follow the clouds you can see just beyond the horizon at dawn. There you will find civilization. So Prosperi hopped up and began heading towards what he believed were those clouds. He walked for days in the desert, grabbing snakes and lizards off the ground and eating them raw. He said his inner caveman came out, like his primal desire to live, and he had no problems eating the things he was eating. Prosperi grew so dehydrated, he couldn't even urinate anymore. So he began drinking the liquid inside of succulents that grew inside of dried-up riverbeds. And he also began sucking out the moisture in his wet wipes that were in his backpack. On the 9th day, Prosperi saw a little shepherd girl off in the distance. And she saw him, and she was scared of him, and she turned and ran away. And at first, Prosperi is devastated because he has no strength to chase after her. But she had actually gone down to Hurtribe and told them about this strange man wandering the desert, and they came running up over the dunes and they brought him in. And they gave him food and drink, and they sent someone to get police. After police picked him up and brought him back to their headquarters, he discovered he had walked over 181 miles from where he had gotten lost on the course, all the way to Algeria. His family Andres organizers had gone out looking for him after he went missing, but all they ever found was his shoelace, and so they assumed he was dead. It would take him 2 years to fully recover from this ordeal, but after he did, he went on to run 8 more desert traces. In 2012, 35-year-old Jose Alvarenga was an extremely experienced fisherman, having spent years and years commercially fishing. In November of that year, Jose volunteered to do a 30-hour deep-sea fishing shift for his company off the coast of his hometown in Mexico. He hoped he'd be able to catch some sharks, marlins, and sailfish, 3 of the more lucrative fish you can catch. Unfortunately, the guy Jose usually went deep-sea fishing with was not able to go at the last minute. But Jose still really wanted to go out and do the shift, and so he took the only other fisherman in their company that was willing to go, or that could go, and it was a 23-year-old, extremely inexperienced, brand new fisherman named Ezequiel Cordova. And while Jose knew he was not going to be a huge asset out on the seas, he figured, it's a short trip and we're not that far off from shore. So you know what? He's fine. I'll take him. On November 17th, the pair set out on their 24-foot fiberglass skiff with a small motor. On board were various fishing tools, a radio, and a large icebox to hold all the fish they were going to catch. Once they reached the area they were going to be fishing, their trip immediately started paying off. And within just a couple of hours, they had already almost completely overloaded the icebox. Their luck was so good that when they saw a storm coming in, they decided to wait and continue to catch as many fish as they possibly could before heading in at the very last minute. But the storm that was rolling in was like the storm of the century. And by the time they did turn around to head into shore, it was too late. They got caught up in this wicked storm where the rain was so intense, they literally could not see to shore. They tried to use their compass and other instruments to navigate to shore. But between the winds and the waves and the fact that their boat was so heavy from the nearly 1,000 pounds of fish they had caught, they were just really unable to get anywhere near shore. When the storm just continued to rage and they were just kind of floundering in the water, they decided they needed to dump their catch. So they dumped all 1,000 plus pounds of fish back into the water. But even then, with a more agile boat, the storm was so severe they just could not navigate effectively. And so Jose turned off the engine and told Ezequiel that their best chance here was to just wait it out, and once it was done, they would head back into shore. But that storm continued to rage for 5 days. The torrential rain never stopped. The waves were huge. The winds were awful. And before long, they were getting pulled out to sea and had no idea where they were. Now, they had only planned to be out for 30 hours, so they did not have much in the way of supplies. And so after a few days, they had run out of food and they had run out of water. But luckily, because it was raining so much, they were able to drink the rainwater. But the real immediate problem they were facing is Over the course of those 5 days, the storm was just battering their boat. And by the time the storm cleared, their boat was ruined. Their motor had been torn off and was just gone. Their electronics were busted, and all of their fishing gear was either damaged or gone. There was enough charge in the radio for Jose to call back to his boss on the mainland and send a message. But the radio died before they got a return message, so they weren't able to confirm if anybody on land was going to come looking for them. Left with minimal supplies, no radio, no motor, Jose and Ezekiel just had to hope somebody on the mainland heard their message, and they slowly began to adjust to life at sea. Jose was able to leap into the water and catch turtles, fish, seabirds, and jellyfish with his bare hands, and so that's what they ate. And then, the two of them would try to catch rainwater whenever they could. But the majority of the time, they had to drink their own urine and turtle blood. Despite their initial optimism that their boss had probably heard their mayday message and would be sending people out to get them, as days turned into weeks and weeks turned into months, they realized that probably no one was coming to find them now. Their only hope was a plane spotted them flying overhead, or perhaps they could drift into a shipping lane and a boat could spot them. But without any way of navigating their boat, they really were just leaving it up to luck. Despite their dire situation, Jose stayed really positive, and he focused on catching food and catching water. And he tracked the time really diligently by tracking the phases of the moon. Ezekiel, however, just did not have a significant role on the boat because he just wasn't skilled enough. And so he found himself sitting in the boat most of the time, doing a whole lot of nothing, and he fell into a deep depression. He was not accustomed to being out on the water the way Jose was. Jose had been raised on the water. He practically only ate seafood, and a lot of it he ate raw. So, in a way, Jose was kind of at home. Ezekiel was not. And then by the 4th month, Ezekiel just could no longer stomach the food they were eating. He would just get sick every single time. And so he just kind of gave up and he stopped eating. And even though Jose urged him to eat and would get him food, he didn't eat it, and eventually he starved to death. Even though Ezekiel was not a huge asset in terms of helping them survive, he did provide Jose an enormous amount of comfort. It was like you had your partner in crime heroine. And then once he died, Jose was alone for the first time in nearly half a year, and he fell into a very dark depression. And for 6 days, he did not touch Ezekiel's body. He just sat there and stared at him, and even contemplated taking his own life. But on the 7th day, he doesn't know what it was, but he had the sudden urge to want to survive. And so he gave Ezekiel a kind of makeshift funeral. He said a few words and then disposed of his body in the ocean. And then after that, Jose became laser focused on just surviving. And survive he would for another 9 months, all by himself out in the middle of the ocean, just floating around, drinking turtles' blood and drinking his own pee. But after those 9 months, he would finally see the thing he had been dreaming about land. He had managed to drift all the way to the Marshall Islands. So he leapt out of his boat, he swam to shore, and there was a hut right on the beach. He knocked on the hut and a couple came to the door, and they were totally shocked to see this guy. I mean, he didn't look too good, and they couldn't believe his story. Hello. They couldn't believe that he had survived for so long in the water, but they quickly brought him inside, they gave him some food and drink, and they contacted authorities and he was saved. His parents and young daughter, when they found out he was alive, they were overjoyed. They, along with everybody else, believed he had perished. They had sent out a search party for them, and they had found pieces of their boat that had broken off in the storm. And so they assumed, they must have sank. Then in a strange turn of events, shortly after he got home, people began accusing him of lying about what happened. People said he looked too good to have been out on the open ocean for 14 months. He should have been emaciated, and at the very least, he should have had scurvy. But doctors would say he ate so many turtles and seabirds that he was pretty well fed. And turtles and seabirds contain a high level of vitamin C that would have protected him from scurvy. Other skeptics said it would have been impossible for his skiff to float these 6,000 miles to the Marshall Islands where he ultimately found land. But then a study done at the University of Hawaii confirmed there was a current that would have pulled him from the coast of Mexico straight into the Marshall Islands. And then lastly, Ezekiel Cordova's family accused Jose of killing Ezekiel and eating his body for sustenance. That's the only way he was able to survive. But Ezekiel roundly rejected that and took multiple lie detector tests that proved he did not do that. Today, Jose lives in a small town in El Salvador, completely surrounded by land, and he says he doesn't go anywhere near the water. In 1971, Julian Ko Epck was a bright-eyed German teenager who had just graduated high school. On Christmas Eve of 1971, she and her mother were at the airport in Lima, Peru, waiting for a flight to Pucallpa to visit her father, who was a zoologist working in the Amazon. She and her mother, and everybody else waiting for this flight, were really annoyed because the flight was 7 hours late due to bad weather. Finally it arrived, and Julian, her mother, and everybody else who had been waiting boarded Lance Flight 508. And immediately after takeoff, they started hitting some pretty bad turbulence because of the bad weather. But Julie really liked flying, so she didn't mind. Her mother, on the other hand, was white KNUC cleaning the armrests. But after 10 minutes or so, as they were getting nearer to cruising altitude, the turbulence was not getting any better. In fact, it was getting much worse, and Julian was starting to get worried herself. Then, when the plane started shaking so violently that all of the overhead bins opened up and luggage and drap presents on Christmas cakes started pouring out, Julian now began white KNUC cleaning the armrest. As she's sitting there, she looks out the window and she sees all this lightning right outside their window. And it was clear they were literally flying through a lightning storm. And so Julian and her mother are just looking at each other, unable to speak because they're so scared. And they're listening to the other passengers screaming and yelling, and everyone's starting to panic. And then the plane starts really shaking up and down, like it's being lifted 50 feet and dropping 50 feet over and over and over. And then all of a sudden, there's this bright flash inside of the cabin, and then the lights go out. And then they look out the left side, and they see smoke and flames coming out of the engine that sits on the wings. And then, the plane felt like it was just falling from the sky before it dipped into an aggressive nosedive and just started bombing straight down toward the ground. It turned out that big flash in the cabin was lightning striking the engine. Julian would say, despite this unbelievable chaos, the worst moment imaginable, her mother grabbed her by the hand and said, "This is it. It's all over." And that was the last thing her mother ever said to her. After that, all Julian can remember is the sound of other passengers screaming and crying, and the awful grinding sounds that the engines were making. And as she's listening to these horrible sounds, getting ready to die, all of a sudden the noise just stops and she's outside of the plane. She's still strapped into her seat, but now she's in free fall away from the plane. And she remembers thinking how unbelievably lonely she was. And then she looked down and she saw the canopy of the jungle fast approaching, and she knew she was about to die. And then she passed out. She remembers nothing of the actual impact, but she would later find out the plane broke up to miles up. She was in free fall for 2 miles in that seat before hitting the ground. She woke up the next day looking upwards towards the jungle canopy, and the first thing she said out loud was, "I survived." And she's looking around and she yells for her mother, but there's no one around her. No one yells back. And that's when she realizes I'm all alone, and probably everybody, including my mother, is dead. She had somehow managed to not only survive, but only have a broken collarbone and some deep cuts in her leg. She could hear planes overhead that were most likely looking for the crash site and potentially survivors. But she couldn't see them because the canopy was so thick, so they couldn't see her. She was wearing a very short, sleeveless mini dress and flip-flops. But, in fact, she had lost one of her flip-flops, but elected to keep the other one on because she had lost her glasses in the crash and she was incredibly nearsighted. And so, she would use this one flip-flop to test the ground ahead of her before committing with her bare foot. Before the crash, she had spent 1.5 years at her parents' research station out in the Amazon, and in that time, She had picked up very valuable survival skills for being in the rainforest. The first thing she did was stand up and go looking for a stream because her father had told her, wherever there's a stream, that stream will oftentimes lead to civilization. And so she began walking, and sure enough, she found a stream. And instead of just walking next to the stream, she got in it and began walking directly in the middle of the stream. Because her parents had told her that you're less likely to get attacked by a predator if you're standing in the water versus standing on land. She only walked a little ways before she came across the crash site. There was no bodies. It was just debris. And all she could find that was useful was a small bag of candy. So she took the bag of candy and continued walking down the stream. And for several days, she trudged along. And she would say during the day it was incredibly hot and miserable, and at night it was very cold. And since she only had the small dress on, it was particularly miserable. She said the scariest part of the whole ordeal was at night when you're trying to sleep. It's totally pitch black and you're in the middle of the Amazon and there's predators all around you. She said it was horrifying. On the fourth day of being in the jungle, as she walked down the stream, she heard the sound of a landing king vulture, a sound that she recognized from her time spent at her parents' Amazon reserve. And the sound of this vulture was just around the corner, so she couldn't see it. But she knew these huge vultures only showed up if there's a ton of dead meat. And so she knew, as soon as she rounded that corner, she was going to come face to face with the bodies from the crash, potentially even her mother. But she kept moving forward. She turned the corner and sure enough, there were bodies. The vulture took off, and what she was left looking at was a bench with 3 passengers on it, still buckled in, and all 3 of their heads had been rammed underneath the earth. They had clearly landed head first. Immediately, she had an intense sense of panic because she had never seen a dead body before, and she thought one of them was her mother. But when she went over to examine this particular corpse, she saw her toenails were painted pink, and her mother never painted her toenails. And so she had this intense sense of relief that it wasn't her mother. But at the same time felt very ashamed of that thought. There was nothing on the 3 bodies or near them that could help her survive, so she said her goodbyes and she continued walking down the stream. By the 10th day of this ordeal, she could barely stand straight because of a broken collarbone and the pain in her leg. And so she began drifting down the river in one of the deeper sections. And then she thought she was hallucinating when she saw this big boat docked up against the side of the river. But when she went up to it and touched it, it was real. She went up on shore. She looked inside. There was no one in the boat, but it looked like a boat that was used. And there was a path that led back into the jungle. And so she followed the path and it led to this hut. And no one was in there, but outside was a jug of gasoline. And she had this wound in her arm that was full of maggots, and she remembered her father using gasoline to get maggots out of a wound in their dog. And so she took the gasoline and dumped it in her arm, and she said it was excruciatingly painful. But she was able to pull out 30 maggots and felt very proud of that accomplishment. After that, she fell asleep inside of the hut and just hoped that whoever lived here eventually showed up. And sure enough, the next day she woke up and she heard 2 men talking outside that were walking towards her. And she said the sound of their voice was like the sound of an angel. And when the 2 men came up the path and saw her, they were obviously very shocked. And they initially thought she was like this water goddess from a local legend that involved a half mermaid, half woman that was light-skinned. And she would tell them in Spanish that she's not a water goddess, that in fact, she's a girl and she had just survived a plane crash and she really needed their help. It was getting late that day, so they couldn't bring her out of the jungle right away. So they helped treat her wounds, they gave her some food and water, and the next day, they brought her back to civilization. The day after her rescue, she was reunited with her father. And apparently he was so overcome with emotion because he believed she was dead that for several hours he just couldn't speak. Julian was the sole survivor of the 91 people who boarded Lance of Flight 508. Her mother actually survived the crash, but then died several days later because she couldn't move. This is something that haunts Julian and her family because they think about how horrible those last few moments for her mother must have been. Julian ultimately recovered from all of her physical injuries, but to this day deals with significant emotional trauma. So, that's gonna do it. Guys, if you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video, and you haven't done this already, please invite the like button over to your house for Oreos and milk, but replace all of their Oreo cream filling with Play-Doh. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3, 4, even 5 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen for 116. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok, where my username is MrBallen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit, just called our MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So, whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's gonna do it. See you. 40 years after us Army soldier went missing on this desolate Alaskan island, researchers make a startling discovery that changes everything about that case. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel because that's all we do. And we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So, if that's of interest to you, please sneak up behind the like button and viciously rear naked choke them. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Alright, let's get into today's stories. On October 9th, 2010, 2-year-old Rowan Griffin was in the back seat of the car next to his 2 older siblings, and his father was driving the car, and they were on their way to this big family party at Rowan's grandparents' house. They lived in Richmond, New Hampshire, which is a pretty rural part of New Hampshire, and their house was literally in the woods. You had to go down this really long driveway to get to it. And it was this single-story home where they had cleared out all the trees in the backyard to kind of clear a space to have these awesome cookouts for family get-togethers. And so Rowan, his 2 siblings, and his dad, they get to the entrance of the driveway that's going to bring them up to the house. And they can already tell there's tons of people here because there's cars lining the driveway all the way out to the street. And so they make their way up the driveway and, sure enough, right in the backyard is just a sea of adults and teenagers and kids. It's this huge family reunion, and Rowan and his 2 siblings just take off running to go play with their cousins. And so, for the next couple of hours, the kids were just running around having a great time, and the adults are having a good time. And at some point, the adults started to notice after the fact. They would say they noticed this. They started to notice Rowan was chasing a cat. There was a cat that lived at the grandparents' house and he loved the cat, and he was chasing it all around the backyard. And at some point, Rowan ran into the woods to chase after this cat, and a number of adults saw him do that. But it was like mob mentality, where they each thought somebody else was watching Rowan. They were not trying to be negligent. They just figured there's so many people here, what can go wrong? In a very short period of time, Griffin realizes he can't find his son. And so, he goes to the kids and he's like, "Hey, have you seen Rowan?" And they're like, "Oh yeah, I think he was chasing a cat. I think he was over there." And then Mr. Griffin asked the adults, and they say the same thing. "Yeah, he was chasing a cat. I think he was over there." And after looking around for him and everybody basically saying he was chasing this cat, and not being able to find him, he just started yelling to the group, "Hey everybody, stop for a second. I can't find Rowan. Everyone's telling me he's chasing a cat. Well, then can you tell me where he went? I don't know where he is." And pretty quickly, they realize he's not in the house, he's not in the backyard, he's not at the end of the driveway. He's not in any of the cars. He's not anywhere. And very quickly, the group started yelling for Rowan. They're running out into the woods, they're looking for him. And Mr. Griffin is like, "I don't know how long he's been gone for. And so he calls 911 right then and there. He's not taking many chances. So the police come out and they launch this huge search. And then all these locals in the area that had Atzvin for wheelers, they came out and they're driving around the forest looking for Rowan. Everybody's yelling for him. There's hundreds of people out there. But as the sun started to fade, they still hadn't found him. They had found no indication of where he went. They assumed he made it out into the forest because the last sign of him was he was chasing a cat into the forest, potentially, but they really didn't know. And so finally, the sun does go down that night, and they have to postpone the search until first light the next morning. And you can only imagine how horrible that was for Rowan's parents as they're sitting inside that night, wondering what's happening to their 2-year-old son who's just out in the woods by himself. So very early the next morning, a whole bunch of volunteers went right back out into the woods to look for Rowan. There was this one particular group that wanted to look a little bit farther away than where everybody else was looking. They were going to be about 3+ miles away in this swamp. And so this group of searchers, they start walking into this swamp, and they can tell right away that it's a very wet and deep swamp. They would take a step onto something that looked solid, and they would sink 2-3 feet into the water. They all had waders on so they wouldn't get wet, but they were basically slugging through the swamp, and it was very thick. And at some point, they make their way through a clearing, and they see on a log what looks like a pair of children's shoes, or shoes for sure. They look small enough to be kids. So they wade their way over and they climb up onto this dry section of land, and they walk over and, sure enough, they're kids' shoes. And so they yell out for him a couple times, and they stop to listen. And after a minute, they hear him call back. He's yelling here, and they walk their way past this huge bush and they look through and they can't believe it. They see Rowan right in the middle of this bog of water. There is a tree that is right in the middle of this, and he's clutched onto the tree. He looks dry, he looks okay, and he's just standing on this island holding this tree. And so immediately, the searchers jump right in the water and they start wading their way out to this island where Rowan is. And the whole time they're going out there, the water's, up to their chest. And they're looking around, and it's at least deep all the way around this thing. And they're looking up at the kid, and he's bone dry, and he's 2 years old, so they don't know if he knows how to swim or not. And so they're thinking to themselves, how did he get out here? But either way, they're like, let's just get the kid and bring him back to his parents. And so they finally hop up onto this island and they kind of look over Rowan. He seems okay. They pick him up, they keep him out of the water, and they bring him back to land and back to his parents. Initially, Rowan's parents and the police and the searchers, everybody is just so happy that Rowan is alive that no one is asking any questions about, what happened and what's the deal with you being found on that island? How'd you get out there? People are just leaving it alone. They're just happy he's here. But after the dust had settled, so to speak, Rowan's parents would ask him some questions, and they would say, what happened? How did you get lost? And how did you get on that island? And at first, Rowan was just not saying anything. But eventually, he would say that there were cows out there. And he said that he was scared of the cows, and that's why he went to the island, because he wanted to get away from the cows. Now, there were no cows in that swamp or anywhere near where he was that night. So either he didn't see anything and he was hallucinating seeing animals at all, or he was mislabeling something else that he was seeing. But whatever he was seeing or believed he was seeing, it scared the heck out of him. And he would get really frightened when he would talk about these cows. But regardless of what he saw or didn't see, the million-dollar question is, how did he get out to that island? Because in order to get out to that island, for him being a 2-year-old, being the size he was, he would have had to swim. The water was too deep all the way around the island, and he didn't know how to swim. But even if he had found a way to magically swim out to this island, why wasn't he wet? It's also worth noting this all took place just a few miles away from the infamous Bennington Triangle, which is this area in southern Vermont where there's been a whole string of people going missing under very mysterious circumstances. In 1953, 11-year-old Jerry Monkman was considered a very frail child. He was skinnier than his peers, he was shorter than his peers, and he had a really bad case of asthma, which was a breathing condition that made doing anything physical really difficult. But despite his perceived fragility, he loved going outside, he loved hiking, and he was a proud member of the Boy Scouts. And so on April 25th of that year, Jerry was really excited when he found out his Boy Scout troop was offering a trip to the Rocky Mountain foothills to go camping and hiking for a weekend. And he jumped at the opportunity. So Jerry, his troop, and his troop leaders, they all pile in a van and they make their way up to the Rocky Mountains. And as soon as they get there, they go on this wickedly rugged hike up in the Teton Canyon. And about an hour into their trip, one of the troop leaders turns around and Jerry's gone. The troop leaders did not know how long he had been gone for, so they only searched for a couple of minutes before one of them ran down the mountain to try to get help. Soon the sheriff's department arrived and 16 volunteers from the town that had heard about this. They all poured out onto the mountain, and they are combing across this mountain to find Jerry as quickly as possible. But after several hours, they couldn't find him, and people started to think the worst. And then just then, the bloodhound they had brought out to try to track his scent picked up Jerry's scent, and it starts taking off up the trail. And the handler of the dog tells everyone, hey, he's picked him up. We're gonna find him, we're gonna find him, we're gonna find him. And he thinks the dog's gonna lead him to him, within a mile or so of where they are. But the dog just stays in a complete baleen for 6 hours. It just tracks straight north for 6 hours until it comes to this big swamp where it stops. Like, I found it. This is where it ends. This swamp was 12 miles away from where Jerry had gone missing. So the handler and the people that had followed this dog, they searched the swamp because even though they thought it was totally improbable that Jerry, this frail 11-year-old with asthma, would have maneuvered 12 miles uphill through rugged terrain to aim the swamp, they still felt like they needed to search it. So they searched the swamp. There wasn't anything there. And so the dog handler's thinking, okay, my dog must have made a mistake. And so he gives the scent again to the dog, thinking the dog will turn and start heading back towards where Jerry had gone missing. But instead, his dog basically just reconfirms that, nope, this is where the scent brought me. I'm still right. And so the dog handler and everybody else that had made this long, treacherous 12-mile journey up to the swamp, they just decided that the dog must have made a mistake and the kid could never have been here. The next morning at 8, Zara, an 8-year-old boy named David, was riding his horse about 30 miles away from where Jerry had gone missing. And he happened to be looking over at the tree line, and the boy stumbles out of the tree line and waves to him. And so David goes over, and it turns out it's Jerry Mockman. Jerry would just tell David that he needs to get back to his group. And David would say, what are you doing out here, eh? And Jerry just said, I don't really know. I need to get back to my group. I was with a group yesterday, and I need to get back to them. And apparently David asked him, well, how did you get here if you were with them yesterday? And all Jerry could say was, I fell asleep under a tree. I don't know. When word got back to the searchers that they had found Jerry, and they had found him 30 miles away, they couldn't believe it. The day before, it had been unbelievable that he could have traveled 12 miles to that swamp. Literally unbelievable. They didn't believe it. Nope, he couldn't have done it. And now clearly, he's traveled at least 30 miles to have been found by David where he was found. And that's 30 miles as the crow flies, meaning overhead air miles. 30 miles. 30 miles. The reality is when you're walking in the wilderness, you don't walk in straight lines. You make turns and you go left. They're switchbacks. And the area he must have gone through over those 30 miles is all unmarked. It's this rugged, hilly, awful unmarked terrain. So, for sure, he probably covered 40 plus miles to get there. And so the police asked him, how did you do this? How did you cover the distance you covered in such a short amount of time? And Jerry would say he just remembers sleeping under a tree and then waking up, and he would see animals poking their heads around from behind different trees. And he didn't know what kind of animals they were, but they were watching him, and he was worried they were gonna hurt him. But They didn't. And he said he was able to just keep walking and he would keep sleeping under these trees, and he kept seeing these animals that were watching him. And he just kept saying, "They never hurt me. He never hurt me." And so obviously, this did not answer any of the questions that the investigators were looking to answer, and they just felt like, okay, maybe he's in shock and we can ask him at another time. But the theory became like, well, then he must have been abducted to have covered this distance. But that begs the question, who's capable of moving an 11-year-old that much distance in such a short amount of time? We're talking about a 30-hour window moving potentially 50-plus miles, lugging an 11-year-old around. And then even if there was someone or something that was capable of lifting up an 11-year-old and maneuvering them that much distance in such a short amount of time, well, to what end? Why would they do that? Why was Jerry then maneuvered to the swamp and then maneuvered to where he was found? It doesn't make any sense. One of the most remote places in the world is BULD, Eyre Island in Alaska. It's 2/3 of the way to Russia along the Aleutian chain of islands. The nearest inhabited island is about 50 miles away. The weather on BULD, Eyre Island is pretty brutal, especially during the winter, and there's no electricity there. In 1944, the United States Army decided they wanted to send 5 of their soldiers to monitor the weather station on BULD, Eyre Island. That was like the one thing the island was used for. And so one of the people that was sent on this assignment was a guy by the name of Bud Houston. Bud was born in Wisconsin and worked in a shipyard before enlisting in the Army in 1942. He was a big hunter and outdoorsman, and so the prospect of living on this kind of desolate Alaskan island really appealed to him, and he was excited about the assignment. In October of that year, Bud was flown out to BULD, Eyre Island, and he met with the other 4 soldiers that were going to be living on the island with him. It was going to be those 5 on the island. No one else is there. And they quickly learned that their job of monitoring the weather station was a very low-effort job, and so they could do all of their tasks over the course of the day pretty easily. And it freed up a lot of time for them to explore the island, and that would actually become their favorite pastime because there really wasn't much else to do there except explore the island. And so very quickly they became very familiar with the whole island, cause it wasn't that big. It was about maybe 2.5 miles wide by 4.5 miles long. On March 3rd, 1945, so 5 months after they've arrived on BULD Eyre Island, so by now they know every square inch of the island. They're very comfortable here. They had to do a routine patrol around the weather station. This was something they did multiple times a week, so very routine. And all 5 of them are sitting in the weather station, and Bud says he'll do it. So Bud gets his rifle and he heads outside to do this patrol, and the other 4 are just sitting in the weather station. And after about an hour, they realize Bud hasn't come back yet. And this patrol does not take more than 20 minutes. And so they step outside to see if he's out there. And the weather at the time was very mild, you know. There's no snow on the ground, it's not very cold, it's not very windy, and the visibility this night was pretty good. And so they're looking out over the island, and the island has no trees. At the very far end, at the opposite end of where the weather station is, there's one significant sized mountain, but short of that, it's not particularly mountainous. So from their perspective, they could look out over the island and basically see everything. And they don't see him anywhere. At first, they were not that worried about it because they figure, you know what? He knows what he's doing. He's been here so long. He's probably just out exploring or something. But they decided they would go look for him. They go down to the water. He's not down there. They walk all around the far side of the island. They can't find him. And so by the time they get back to the weather station, they were like, we have to tell the command that we've lost him. So they radio back to higher command and they say, we don't know where he went. He went out on patrol and we didn't hear anything, and now he's gone. And so a whole bunch of reinforcements came out to the island to look on foot with the other 4 soldiers, as well as planes and helicopters. And for 2 days, they looked all over that island for Bud, and they couldn't find him. And you gotta remember that there's very few places you could possibly even go on the island that they wouldn't be able to look and see you. And so Everyone started to think he must have jumped into the water or fallen into the water because there's nowhere for him to hide on the island. And so after a couple of days, they were so sure that it was just not possible for him to be on the island that they called the search off and they said he must have fallen into the water. Fast forward 40 years to 1988, and the US Fish and Wildlife Service was studying birds on Buldir Island, and they made this amazing discovery. This crew had set up their camp at 16 feet of elevation on the one large mountain on the far side of the island, basically on the opposite end of the island from the weather station. And one of the crew members happened to just walk around one of the boulders, and they looked down and there was this little tiny crevice between the boulder and the ground. And he thought he saw something inside of it, and he got down and he looked, and he realized there was a skeleton that had been kind of crammed into this tiny little tight space. And the skeleton had a military uniform on. It had been kind of balled up, but there was a uniform on what was left of the skeleton. And there was also a rifle that had been jammed down in there as well. And it would turn out to be Bud Houston. So why did Bud say he was going to go outside and do that patrol, which really just meant walking around the immediate vicinity of the weather station? You're certainly not traveling very far. Why did he say he was going to do and then walk 4.5 miles to the other end of the island and then climb up 16 feet to the top of this mountain? But even if he had a reason to be over there, why would he then force himself into this little tiny crevice if he was looking for shelter? Well, the weather was incredibly mild. It would not have been life-threatening to be out in the elements, at least not that first night or even that second night. And he knows the island like the back of his hand. He probably had a little bit more time. He probably could have found a better place for shelter than this awful little crevice. But if he was at a place where he was seeking shelter under these boulders, instead of just walking back to the weather station and getting real shelter, then he had to have been in an emergency situation. That's the only way that makes sense. But if he was in an emergency situation, he would know that his responsibility is not just to survive, it's also to be found again, and to make sure you're not obscured underneath a boulder so no one can find you and can find you. This island, it was like the easiest place to be found. There's no trees. There was helicopters overhead and planes, and there's all these people. It's a small space. All he had to do was not be under the boulder 24/7. Maybe during the day when the weather let up, roll out from under the boulder, let yourself be found. But that's not what happened. What probably happened is Bud somehow got crammed into that little tiny crevice almost immediately after he left the weather station to do that patrol. But logically speaking, he would not do that to himself. So someone else had to do it. But all the other people on the island were in the weather station at the time this would have been happening. So it really makes you wonder what happened when he walked outside of that weather station. Or what did he see? And what did they do to him? Unfortunately, we'll probably never know. So that's gonna do it, guys. I hope you enjoyed today's stories. Let me know in the comments if you found the secret. Tell us what it is and where you found it. Give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comment section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please sneak up behind the like button and viciously rear naked choke them. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3, 4, even 5 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen for 116. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok, where my username is MrBallen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit, just called our MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So, whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's gonna do it. See ya.